Actually, in Linear, we're creating teams and dissolving them quite fluently.
If the linear product is any kind of reflection of the system that produces it, clearly something's working there.
And then at the moment, it just clicks. And it's like, okay, this makes sense. This feels good. Now let's reduce the scope, build something, get it to customers as soon as possible. We introduced like a zero bugs policy. So we're pretty much saying if bugs come in, you need to fix them. If you fix them today or in 2 months, it's still the same amount of time. So you still need to fix them, right?
We call it product responder, but essentially the premise is that we are in advance ring fencing capacity to handle reactive work.
It can be like 2 pixels off in a button, right? It doesn't matter what it is. But the point is you need to find it yourself. It's like we want to have folks that kind of build an eye for catching these small things. Incidents are all hands on deck. An incident comes in, it's pretty much whoever is needed and can help in that incident will drop everything and manage that incident. It's cheap to create incidents. It's cheap, it's easy, why not? You have the typical, you have the scope of the project, the time, and then the number of people, right? And then which two do you choose? And he was like, there's no triangle. It's like, what do you mean there's no triangle? It's like, and he goes like, there's no scope. It's like, if you can ship less, just ship less.
Sabine, great to have you here today. And Lisa too, regular on the debrief, which is awesome to see. Great to have you back. So today we're talking about planned and unplanned work. But before we dive into all the questions, it'd be great for us all to sort of get acquainted. Sabine, maybe you first. Maybe if you give us a quick background of, what you do, where you work, and we'll go from there.
Of course. So my name is Sabine. I'm working as an engineering manager in Linear. I'm responsible for the U side of the engineering team. I joined Linear about 2 years ago now.
Wonderful. Happy customers of Linear since the very beginning. So, honestly, very excited to have someone from your side on the podcast. Lisa, I imagine anyone who's listened to the podcast before has almost certainly heard your intro, but for anyone listening for the first time, do you want to give us a quick background on yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I was one of the founding engineers here at Incident.io. Joined when there were like 5 of us in a really, really small room above a fire station, and then been very involved. So I was our first tech lead. Our CTO took paternity leave at one point and sort of left me for about 6 weeks with engineering manager and tech lead hats on, which was an interesting process for all involved. But kind of since then been like very involved in thinking about how we plan work, how we organize things as teams, and setting up our sort of model team that we've now like reproduced a few times. So we're now up to like 4 teams. And that's kind of all about like having these kind of carbon copies almost of like, every team is different, but still thinking about how do we run process? How do we think about planning? And just how does that evolve over time when you start with 5 people and you end up at 80? You can't just sit in a room on a Friday afternoon and decide what you're going to do next week anymore, sadly. So yeah, that's me.
Perfect. We will dive into that shortly. I guess to kick off with you then, Sabine, pretty broad opening question, but like how do you like best plan for planned work? Like what is your sort of structure and process for doing that?
Yeah, of course. So we don't have a very strict process on planning. We pretty much split the product into 4 focus areas. So that would be discovery, planning, execution, and insights. And we basically plan projects within those areas. In terms of what we actually built, we started off of pretty much building the things that we felt needed to be built, because we're a small engineering company. We're using the product every day, and people tend to be quite passionate about product and opinionated. So that got us a long way. But in the last couple of years, our customers started becoming significantly bigger than us, sometimes 10, 20 times. And when you have a customer that's 20 times bigger than you, it's really hard to be confident that I know what we should build. So that's when we started shifting our focus a lot more on customer feedback, maybe from direct customer conversations, maybe from our customer support Slack channels. We also started kind of thinking of the users of Linear in terms of personas. So initially we focused quite heavily on engineers, but now we are looking more into, how do we make PMs love Linear, right? What's the difference between what a frontline manager like myself versus a director? How would they use Linear? So we think more into those frames as well. that's kind of the baseline of how we think about the projects that we are actually building. And then when it comes to actually like building a product, it pretty much starts off of like, okay, this is the next batch of things, like people are freed up, and then what do we build next? And sometimes the projects are as simple as a name. Like we need to build insights, as people are asking for. We have a understanding of what that would be valuable, like what is insights, what's the scope, and so on. We'll figure that out, right? So to figure that out, we basically set up project teams. Actually, in Linear, we were creating teams and dissolving them quite fluently. So we have a project, let's say product insights. We create a team that contains, of course, a product manager, but as well as engineers, customer experience, design, right? And then everybody gets together and goes like, okay, we're building insights, right? And from the product side, it's like, hey, this is why this is why I think this is useful. Here's some customer feedback around it. This is kind of what we gain by building it, right? And then on the engineering side, it's like, oh, but I thought about this, or I want to know this, right? So it's this type of conversation in a kickoff meeting. We have a kickoff meeting, we have all of these conversations, and then we kind of end the kickoff meeting, and sometimes there's no conclusion to it, right? So, okay, let's think about it. Let's meet in 2 days, right? We meet in 2 days again. Now, product has a more crisp version of the problem statement and why we're building it. And on design, we already have some rough designs on how this could work. Engineering maybe does a prototype, see how things actually feel, or when you put real data into the product, right? And then we keep on getting closer to it, right? And we do this iteration a few times, and then at the moment it just clicks, and it's like, okay, this makes sense, this feels good. Now let's reduce the scope and build something, get it to customers as soon as possible, and get some real feedback from the real world. So that's kind of the overall process around planning.
Yeah, love to hear it. Love to hear it. A couple of things that struck me in that. One of which is like the, early days company. It's easy. I think like relatively easier to do planned work because you have fewer customers sort of telling you what they want, and B, because you probably don't have many customers, like incidents and things like that. Also, so like unplanned work generally is lower. So you do a lot more sort of, here's what we want to build, kind of outwards kind of thing. How do you actually balance like we want to build this, but we've also got an enormous customer who wants this thing, and we've got these other people telling us these things, and then we've got customers with support saying these things are causing lots of support load, we want to fix them. Like how do you think about that in the context of planning?
Oh yeah, that's a difficult question to ask. I don't think we have like a recipe for how to solve that. But I would split it up in a few things. So when it comes to stuff around bugs, around issues with the product, like we manage that kind of in a different way than anything else. So we basically plan time for that. We have a support rotation. We can talk about it next. But so that's kind of taken care of, continuously, and sometimes even ahead of time. And we can discuss about what that means. And then when it comes to this, a lot of customers are asking for some specific feature, and then a really big customer is asking for another one. We generally want to build a product that kind of we believe in, and we believe it offers the value that we think we should. So we try to focus on that. So I give you an example. If, for example, a very big customer will ask for a specific thing, that we don't intend to build, we'll probably not build it. We had an example like this when we had some important customers asking for a specific thing, and we planned to build it, but just like in 6 months. It was like, we'll see when we get to it, but it's going to be this year. And then
Really?
then we went like, you know what, we are going to build it now. Why? Because we knew we wanted to build it. It's just a question of prioritizing it. So I think
that's always felt like the easy mode for us as well, which is like big customer wants quite big feature delivered, and we're like, well, we desperately want to do it too, so you've just sort of given us the I guess like the reason to move it forward in time. I could ask more. One question, one thing you brought up was this concept of like ephemeral / sort of like project teams. And I guess rather than ask the question, maybe Lisa, I'll throw to you, because I know that this is very similar to what we did in the early days. We don't do it now, but maybe if you can give us a bit of color on like planned work at Incident.io, that'd be helpful.
Yeah, sure. So if we think about like early days, handful of engineers, we were absolutely working in, I think, pretty much the same way as Sabine's described. So ephemeral teams, you pull together a team for a project. Projects, generally, we tried to keep our projects really small. So our projects were like 1 to 3 weeks. Anything above 3 weeks generally started to sit a bit uncomfortably with us. That's partly because pace is a really big part of our value proposition. And it's also that we believe quite strongly that generally there is something you can deliver in a sort of shorter window, and then maybe you can loop back. And sometimes it makes sense to do, you know, version 1, version 2, version 3 straight away. But particularly at the beginning, where we had like a very big product surface area to cover and a lot of things we wanted to build, we tended to do a V1, do a different, you know, do the V1 of 3 or 4 things, and then loop back around once we've got a bit more signal. Because that would just give us a bit more conviction in what we were doing and the direction we were taking it in. And also from a technical point of view, it just gives things time to sort of settle and bed in, which is often quite useful. We then at a certain point decided to split teams. And that was the first time we were going to have something that wasn't an ephemeral team. And that was about status pages. So we wanted to pull together a team to build something that was a much bigger scope than any sort of single project that we'd run before. And we thought it made a lot more sense to have a group of people that was specifically dedicated to that and would continue to own that. The reason that we made that decision, I think, was partly about velocity. So it is faster to build something when you built layer 1, then you can build layer 2 and you can build layer 3 because you were there and you have all the context. And what we were finding was that our surface area was getting bigger and bigger, and it was becoming more difficult to onboard people into that because it was just such a large surface area of product and code. The flip side of that is that if you split yourself into teams, you obviously restrict, you kind of give yourself fewer options, right? So it used to be really great. You'd be we were like 12, 13 engineers. Who's doing what this week? And you can kind of rearrange your pieces on the chessboard. And all of a sudden, there are sort of, 4 people have been taken out of that. And you don't have them, those pieces are no longer yours. I think the reason that felt okay is that they weren't gone. They were just in the next room, right? And if we needed them, we could just go and wave and be like, hey, I think you'd be really good for this project. Can you just do a couple of weeks here? And I think that is the kind of spirit in which we've kept our teams going since then. As we've sort of grown our teams more and more, we have teams where everybody has a home, and that's by default where they're going to be working. We handle reactive work slightly separately, and I'll chat about that later. But in terms of these kind of home teams, I think it's important, particularly when you're onboarding into a smaller section of code, of product. You're thinking about one persona generally in particular, or 1 or 2 of our key personas, rather than trying to like split your focus across the whole thing. And it means that you can kind of build this like mini kind of machine in the machine that can start to like ship product in that area really quickly. However, when things happen, which they do, we are quite quick to pull levers and move things around. And so that might be, we had a big on-call launch and started off being just the on-call team. And then increasingly we sort of pulled a few different folks in. Like my team ended up doing all of the billing stuff for on-call. We don't own billing, we don't own on-call, but we had time in our roadmap and it was the most important thing. And so I think it's just about, if you are going to split those teams, there are other things that you can do to try and gain that flexibility. But if you refuse to do that and you sort of draw these like very hard lines between teams, I think particularly as a startup or a scale up where you care about velocity, you can find yourself making some really weird sort of prioritization decisions kind of forced on you by that structure, or you end up with like 2 people in a team. And like I've seen that before, where you sort of go, well, this team isn't important, so we're just going to take people away from it. And now we've got like, two people just hanging out there on their own who don't really know why they're there. And you're like, surely there was a better way. And so, yeah, I think that flexibility is really important.
Sure. That makes sense. Sabine, do you have anything similar to that with it sounds like your teams are sort of like, here's a thing to deliver, assemble a bunch of people, deliver it, and then like iterate around a little bit like what Lisa was talking about in the sort of, I guess, the earlier days for us. So I'm assuming it must be working for you. Is it working well? Is there challenges, or if you sort of cracked the code and you've got the right kind of culture that allows for that to work well?
I mean, so far so good. Good. we care about it, so we'll try to make it work for as long as possible. I do realize the downsides of it as you hire more and more engineers. But yeah, so far it's working well. I would say that we also have a split between US and EU. And we try to just have people not have awkward meeting hours. So that kind of makes some like projects split in between the time zones. There are exceptions to that. There are projects where we work across time zones, and that also creates a specialization type of thing, right? Where few people are better at this particular part of the product, right? So definitely when we create teams, that is a factor, right? Like if you have a project that is quite important, and there's this one person that has a lot of experience in that area, it would naturally be that person goes to that area. But on my side, as a manager, I do tend to talk to everyone in the team and have this kind of rubric of like what people want to learn, work on next, and things like this. So some people may be like, I want more backend. Like I'm just focusing on front end. I like front end, but I want to learn more backend or stuff like that. And then when we create these teams, obviously the knowledge before is one factor, but also the interest of people. So that creates situation where, for example, a person may be really motivated for learning more backend, but that means they would need to be in a project that they don't know anything about. But that kind of they compensate each other because there is the enthusiasm, and then they are more kind of open to learning new things in the product. And yeah, so far so good. I hope we can keep it longer.
Yeah, I mean, I'll go for it, Lisa. If you've got a follow-up, go for it.
I was just going to ask, like, how big is a project team normally for you?
Yeah, so in terms of engineering, in terms of engineers, I don't remember having more than 3 engineers on the project team. We try to avoid, like, we had a moment where we like 1 engineer per project team. So it's like, I don't know how it happened, but we had like as many project as engineers almost, and we made quite a hard rule to have at least 2 people on a project. It also comes down to working remotely. It's a little bit, I mean, it's generally not easy to be the only person on the project, but when you're the only person and you're also the only person in that city that you live in working in Linea, right? You don't meet with anyone. Yeah, so it's kind of 2 birds with 1 stone there. That's why we decided to have 2 people on every project. So
it's very cool. It's very cool. I think if the Linea product is any kind of reflection of the system that produces it, clearly something's working there. In that it seems cohesive and tight. And yeah, I don't know. I've always looked at Linea from outside in as a company that's like very unafraid to sort of like chart their own path. So it's interesting seeing how that goes. And I'll be super curious to sort of chat to you folks in a year and see how it's evolved over time. But also like I genuinely love the approach. The thing you said there about like, maybe it won't work forever, but it's working for now, which is something that I've repeatedly found myself saying as like founder of a company where, it's like everything we do, like support is a great example. We are very, very tight with our customers on support, and people are like, yeah, but when you become, an enormous company with 10,000 customers, and I'm like, yep, we'll fix it when we get to that point. But until then, it's great and it's working. So, yes, let's talk about unplanned work. You've both kind of alluded to this, and it's sort of the flip side of the like, we want to just get heads down and assemble our project teams and build stuff. But like, as we know, like stuff will inevitably come up. So whether that's like, I don't know, like growth in scope, or whether it's like bugs coming, you identify that you have to jump on, or feature requests that are urgent, or incidents that like derail everything. Like, how do you folks think about like and sort of work around unplanned work, Sevin?
yeah, so yeah, if I would pick 3 categories, right, we would have bugs, we would have incidents, and then we would have like urgent product type of work. So for bugs, we have a few things to deal with bugs. So the first one is the triage responsibility. We call it the goalie rotation. So we basically have 1 person from EU and 1 person from US. Every week, it's a rotation. There's 1 person that is responsible for basically being the front line on the engineering side for any bugs that get reported. And that's where we also have an integration with Incident.io, which basically allows you to pull this to pull these schedules from Incident.io into Linear, rather than have to create your manual rotation in Linear. And so that's one, right? And then the goalie will not only fix bugs. I think the main role of the goalie is that the queue, the triage queue, stays empty, right? That doesn't mean if they have time to fix the bug, then yes, by all means, right? But the more important bit is acknowledging the bug, seeing how severe it is, and assigning it to the right person. But also they would go on the customer experience channels on Slack, and they would answer different questions from customers directly there. So there's this it helps us get engineers closer to the customer as well, which is great. So that's kind of one part that we handle, the kind of the mainstream of the bugs, right? Then we started experimenting with something quite interesting. I think I'm still like, we'll see how it works. But we introduced like a 0 bugs policy. So we're pretty much saying, like, I think the statement there is, if bugs come in, you need to fix them. If you fix them today or in 2 months, it's still the same amount of time. So you still need to fix them, right? But it's actually not a zero-sum game, because a customer would appreciate more having the current product work than a part of the product that they haven't seen yet being built, right? So so we believe it's not a zero-sum game, and that's why we pretty much said, okay, when a bug comes in, that's the main priority. So realistic how that looks, most engineers would start their morning with, what bugs do I have? Let me fix those, and then go to product work. So it's an interesting approach. We managed already to clean our backlog of bugs, but of course we looked a little bit at the data, and once we clean all our bugs, if we look historically, there would be around 2 bugs per engineer per week, which is quite manageable. It's just you need to prevent the backlog being built. But once you do that, it's quite. It seems that it would work. And if it ends up being 5 bugs per engineer per per week, then there is another question: why are there so many bugs? So in a way, that also is like a kind of self enforcing mechanism, where if you spend too much time on bugs, then you kind of have to focus to not have bugs in the first place anymore. So that's another way where we manage bugs. And finally, the last one is like these things that are not really bugs, but they are like quality fixes. Is like it's working, but just doesn't feel right. So for almost, I think it's been over 6 months now, we do this thing when on Wednesday we do demos of quality fixes. So basically, for every engineer in the team, during the week, outside of their normal work, they will need to find one quality issue. It can be like 2 pixels off in a button, right? It doesn't matter what it is. But the point is, like, you need to find it yourself. It's like, it's not a bug, not something that was reported by someone, but it's just because we want to have folks that kind of build an eye for catching these small things. And Thomas, one of the founders, is particularly good at that. And this started at, like he was sharing his screens, like, look in this corner here, what's wrong, right? And we were all looking, it's like, we can't see what's wrong, right? And there was something wrong, we just couldn't see it, right? So they were like, how do we kind of help people to train that eye for like seeing all these small details? So that is kind of another way of treating this sort of pseudo bugs.
Yeah, that's super cool. I think I probably account for a fair share of the feedback on like UI nits. In fact, Lisa's done a massive push on this recently to sort of up-level our product on the sort of design side. So we have a lot more consistency now. That's fascinating, though. I think it's really interesting. One thing you touched on was like those sort of the bugs and the sort of the categories. Like incidents is obviously one category of thing, which is like slightly different to, I would imagine, bugs, in the the degree of urgency maybe is ramped up on those, where a bug, your 0 bug policy is essentially, we want to fix it and we want to fix it quickly. But I would imagine order of days versus order of months is what you're shooting for. And then incidents, you thought normally we'll be thinking in like order of minutes and hours. How does that fit into the workflow for you folks?
Incidents are all hands on deck. Like an incident comes in, it's pretty much whoever is needed and can help in that incident will drop everything and manage that incident. So that's in a way quite straightforward. And And of course, we use Incident.io for the coordination, for the communication, right? For getting the Slack channel set up, getting the Zoom calls set up, and all of that. So yeah, that's pretty straightforward.
Nice. What is, just out of curiosity, like what is the threshold for you for when a bug becomes an incident? I think that's an area where we've had a lot of folks ask about that, because it gets a bit fuzzy, right? If it's a bug but it needs fixing, it's blocking someone doing some core workflow, is that an incident or is it a bug? Like, I'm curious how you folks draw that line.
Yeah, I mean, I think the naming is not as important as like how fast do you need to fix it, right? So it kind of comes down to that, and then we use incidents as a method of coordinating that fix, right? So and communicating to the customers for like really bigger things that will impact them. So I would have to say that there's no, like, we don't have a metric of like, I remember I was working Uber before, right? And you had a very clear, if it impacts between this many and this many users with a revenue of whatever, then it is a P2 or P1 or P0, right? It's all about, I guess it's all about judgment. And we train that judgment, right? Like we have one, then we reflect on it. Should this have been an incident? And I think we pretty much now default to anything that kind of needs to be fixed now. It's cheap to create incidents. It's cheap, it's easy, why not? So then we kind of, I see quite a few incidents coming in for things that we could just fix, but we choose to do that so everybody's aware of what's happening.
Yeah, I love that. And I think like that kind of degree of pragmatism and just like trusting that judgment and intuition, I think it gets strained as you get very, very large in organizations, because it's very hard to train that level of sort of intuition and judgment. But yeah, I'm super aligned, and we're in a similar position. I think, I mean, we probably skew way far down the, like, if it needs any kind of reactive urgency, it's an incident for us, and it's a great sort of way for us to cheaply like dog food our product. But maybe that's a nice segue. Lisa, like similar sort of question for you, if you can remember the original one, which is like broadly, how do you factor in unplanned work in the engineering efforts at Incident.io?
Yeah, so I think it's basically a very similar story. So we call it product responder, but essentially the premise is that we are in advance ring fencing capacity to handle reactive work up to a certain point. So the way that we view product responder is like their job is to like do as much as they can of what's coming in, but also if the world is on fire, then obviously you pull more people in. You don't just sort of let it burn. So I think one distinction for us is that generally product responders are responsible for incidents here. So they will be the people holding the pager in ours, and then would escalate kind of to the rest of the company as they need to pull people in. Generally speaking, particularly if there's like an incident that's related to a project that's ongoing, you would just pull in the project team and kind of hand it over to them or work with them to deal with that. One thing that's quite nice is it kind of breaks up those teams that we were talking about earlier. So each team sort of gives one person as product responder for the week. And that means that you get to work with people outside your team. It means you get a little bit of cross-product context. You get a chance to, again, like get a little bit closer to customers in a different way. So more in a support capacity than generally our engineers might be talking to customers in sort of product discovery type situations, which is a little bit different to understanding like where a customer might be confused and where there might be some rough edges in our product. And so I think that like overall it's a very similar approach, right? Just with a slightly different lens on it. One of the things that we've recently changed, which I kind of don't yet know what the impact is, but I think it was probably, it felt like a good change, is we've started to have each team has like a reactive work bucket. And that means that product responders can then push that work back into the teams. And the reason for that was partly when we had things coming in where you just needed somebody with a lot of context. And that's very difficult if you're sort of a generalist in that role. But the main reason we did it was so that teams could sort of feel the pain a little bit. And what I mean by that is if you ship a project, sometimes like if you mess it up a bit, there's going to be like maybe a lot of sort of bugs or rough edges, like small feature requests that are coming through as a result of that project. And if product responder sort of eats all of that, what can sometimes happen is that teams aren't really aware that that's happening. And so those like mental tickers that you have of like, oh, we should probably loop back there or do some investment there, or like that UX there is definitely not right. We need to sort of go and take a second run at it. That signal was getting lost. And so I think it'll be interesting to see how that works, because the clear upside being we get more of that signal. Hopefully, that means that like teams just get a little bit more of a pulse on the kind of stuff that's coming in. The downside there being it's no longer purely ring fence capacity, and so you now have something which is a distraction from the project that somebody is on. Whereas originally the way that we sort of set up our processes, the sort of core driving factor behind that was how can we allow somebody as much focus time as possible to build the one most important thing that they're working on. And so I think that's always going to be like a bit of a trade-off. And I don't know if this is, I kind of like what you were saying of like, it's working for now. I don't think this is going to be the final form and, you know, we're sorted forevermore, but that's how we're trying it at the moment. And it feels pretty good.
Yeah, it's very interesting. It's interesting how kind of similar the approaches are, and we haven't conferred on this stuff. And I know you call it the goalie, and we call it product responder. But it feels like this kind of model of ring fencing some capacity to try and protect the teams is working pretty well there. I guess I know from our side certainly that there are times when the reactive workload like immediately overflows the capacity of the sort of the first line product responders, and in that world you end up with, you know, your planned work has to get displaced. Is that, I guess, Sabine, is that like a similar thing for you? Like, and what happens to the planned work when, you know, it all overflows? Is issues like kick everything down the road? Is it like big reprioritization? How do you folks think about it?
We actually changed from having one goalie for the entire company to two. So this already helps like more issues to be actually resolved by the goalie within the rotation. But still, majority of issues would be assigned to individuals in the team. And now that we have this, you know, zero bug policy, that is quite disturbing to their work. If you feel if you think in that sense. And we're trying to see if that's too much. But the idea behind it is, if there is an issue, like you need to fix it, right? So, and then like we need to prevent having a lot of issues or a lot of noise in the system, right? But ultimately, if the product is not working for the customers, then that needs to be fixed. And then if that, you know, then everybody kind of decides how to manage that within their own day, right? And how do they feel about it? Like, do they want to, you know, maybe work on a project and then, you know, switch to a bug and then go back to the project and do it in the morning, as we were saying before. We didn't like we need to see how it will work, especially with the zero. But even before the zero bugs policy, like it was working like this. Bugs were assigned and they were not fixed within, you know, that week or within a few days, but, you know, they were eventually fixed. So it's about everybody having kind of the maturity to decide on how they prioritize their own work. And also we're quite flexible with planning in general. So there's no it's very, very rare that we have a fixed deadline. A project takes as much as it takes. The thing that we sort of, quality is not something that we can ever you know, compromise on. So the only variable there that we do play with and is the scope. Like, and the idea is, I remember when I joined the company, I was asking Thomas, you know, you have the typical, you know, you have the scope of the project, the time, and then the number of people, right? And then which two do you choose? And he was like, "There's no triangle." It's like, "How do you mean there's no triangle?" It's like, and he goes like, "There's no scope." It's like, if you can ship less, just ship less, right? So, so pretty much kind of that's what we play with. So yeah, if bugs come in. You know, the project will take longer, but it's not a big thing. It's like rarely have I seen people be like, "Oh, I had today some bugs to fix and tomorrow some bugs to fix," and it's like this keeps on getting pushed forward. Those conversations are not needed because we don't ask the question very often, like, "What's the date in which you ship this?" Right? It's just this continuous moving forward of the project.
Yeah. So you're telling me you're not doing waterfall software development? That's what I'm hearing. I guess like similar question for you, Lisa, on the, like, you know, how often does it overflow and how often do we end up displacing or having to prioritize? And maybe like a subsequent question is like, how actively, if at all, do you track planned versus unplanned work?
In general, Like the day-to-day, I think, is probably very similar to what's been described. Like something comes up and you deal with it because that is the only option. In the like, either something's coming in and it needs to be done now, in which case we're going to do it now, or it doesn't need to be done now, in which case we're not going to do it until the end of the project. And realistically, there's not very much that's in between. So it's like, it's either sort of, yeah, it's either today or it's like, cool, well, when the next person's sort of free off a project, they'll pick this up before they move on to the next thing. In terms of like how that affects our plans, it's basically the same as any other way in which a project overruns. And there are lots of different reasons why a project would overrun. So we tend also to not have kind of strict deadlines, or certainly not like customer facing deadlines, but we use internal deadlines as like a planning tool, and also like a way of keeping ourselves accountable for what we think we should be able to ship in a certain kind of space of time. Equally, like half our projects probably don't end when we think they're going to end, maybe more, because honestly, like software engineering is like building a house. It's really, really difficult to predict. You've got huge numbers of variables. And I think unplanned work is just another one of those variables. And so I think the muscle that you need to build in order to combat that is to make sure as a team you can regroup, come back together, figure out when your new timeline is so that you can communicate that to, for example, any customers or prospects who might be waiting on this. And also start to think about, okay, well, is there anything that we can do to maybe ship some of it earlier? Is there anything that we've learned? Like, it's often like a good chance to say, oh, well, now I think about it, we probably could cut this bit of scope, or, there's this other thing that maybe we don't have to do straight away. And you just use it as a forcing function to keep rehabbing that conversation. Kind of, I think what Thomas was saying about the triangle, where like in those three, it's like scope, right? You're always looking at it and being like, what would happen if, like, what if we just did that bit for now? And I think that's the way that you get real pace. Like you could drive pace by telling people to go faster, but by far the most effective way of driving pace is to do fewer things. And so finding, the right bit of scope, I think is the magic ingredient there. Yeah, just thinking about your question about tracking. So we have some workload dashboards in Incident.io, which I basically live in. So there's a dashboard and it basically says, this is how many minutes people have spent working on incidents this week. And because we track basically anything that's sort of urgent in an incident, that tells you where all your interrupts are. And it gives you a really accurate estimate because we can use like Slack channel data to understand whether someone's working on something. So more than any like other tool I've ever had access to as like a leader, I get a really good pulse on like how many people, how much time is being spent there. And my team's just shipped a sort of explore by team dashboard into Insights, which I've wanted for a really long time. And it's very exciting. And I can get to see and I can cut all the data and you can see like, oh, is my team doing more or less than other teams, and who is it within that team and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, just like a slightly cheeky product plug, but genuinely it's the thing that I'm in our product for like every single week. Even if I'm not on call, I'm not responding to incidents, I will always open that because it just gives me a really good gut feel for what's going on. And then I can obviously use that as a starting point to trying to figure out the why. So, you see a big spike in reactive work and you're like, was that one big incident? Was it 10 incidents? Was there something else going on? Have we got like an alert noise problem? Things like that. Have we got like a project that's gone south and created a load of reactive work that way? And then we have similar insights that we pull off the linear data as well. So that's looking more about like bug reports, feature requests, and trying to get the similar kind of analysis. I don't think we've yet got a good way of working out how long someone spends on something. I think other than like some quite creepy Big Brother software on people's laptops, that's just a little bit difficult to do. But I wonder if there is something there of like, if you're adding comments into linear or looking at pull requests, if we could start to do something really cool there about trying to estimate like the impact of those tickets. I'm used to the kind of like the extra small ticket, which turns out to be a day of like digging down some horrible Jira rabbit hole. And, stuff like that is a little bit harder to report on still.
Yeah. This is also going to sound like a product plug, and it's deliberately, I always try not to, but the workload insights is actually one of what I think is the only dashboard that I actually routinely go and look at. And I think that one of the canonical examples of where it was useful for me is we shipped on call like a pretty big chunky project, which was very different to how we normally ship product, in that it was like a behind closed doors for 4 or 5 months kind of thing. And then we launched it, and as you can expect, like, we'd done like soft launches with customers, and suddenly loads of people start using it, and we have what feels like to me, I'm like, there feels like there's a lot of incidents going on and like a lot of bad things. And I'm like, how bad is this? And it was like, I looked at that graph and I'm like, well, there are lots of minutes attributed to reactive work here, but because everything is kind of tagged beneath that, it's like, is this bad? Is it reliability things? And it's like, no, what this actually is like a lot of like, people are sort of stretching the limits of configuration and hitting corners of the UI that you sort of never thought they would, or we overflowed something purely in like the front end, and you're like, oh, that looks silly, it's a design problem. And kind of gives you that confidence where I think without that kind of stuff, sometimes you rely a little bit on intuition, and that might be the kind of thing where a past me would have gone, put the brakes on everything, this feels catastrophic, we have everything going wrong everywhere, kind of thing. So I think it is a very useful context overlay for like engineering teams. I never asked you that question, Sabine. Like how, like I imagine not to that same degree, but like, do you care at all about the balance of planned and unplanned work, or are you sort of comfortable with the goalie and the number of bugs being like at zero? Is that the only metric that is sort of important?
We take a slightly different approach here. So what we do, we have a weekly meeting, and we start that meeting with doing what we call a health check. So it's basically me before the meeting kind of looking at a few dashboards and coming to the team and go like, hey, here's how things are going. So one of them is what we call on-call health. And that is basically how many alerts, how many of them are mapped to actual incidents, how many are flaky. And then we also look at SLAs. We look now, of course, at the zero bug thing. We look at how's it called, the goalie rotation, the triage queue, and seeing how that evolved during the week and if we kind of managed to close it at the end. So, and then we talk as a team, and so it's not absolute numbers, but it's more of what's the progress here, right? So we look at, okay, this week we had 50 alerts, right? Like we used to have a time when we had 50 alerts, out of which maybe 15 were actual, related to something that was real, and the rest are flaky. And then doing that every week kind of starts painting a picture of progression over time. And the moment we feel like this is a problem, then we kind of start acting on it. So concretely, especially on the flaky alerts, we discussed, we saw they are quite disturbing, and we were like, okay, from now on, a flaky alert, we don't just resolve, we kind of follow through and make sure that doesn't trigger in whichever way, right? That is need to be done. And also assigning leads to this particular problems proved really, really useful, to have a person, not necessarily that builds all the fixes, that's everybody builds the fixes, right? And the person is on call would, follow up with it, but somebody that keeps an eye on it and kind of sees it, how it evolves over time. So for example, we used to have like 50, and I remember, I think last week it was the first time where we had like 0 flaky alerts. So any alert that we had was for a good reason. So that's kind of how we manage it. So we don't really compare with the planned versus unplanned, but we more look at the unplanned and see if that feels healthy to us, and track it over time.
I think we've covered like the parts of like the nice intersection. Like it's always nice to have a little bit of a talk about the actual product behind all of this kind of philosophy and practice and process that exists in these teams. Lisa, any product intersection points you want to highlight? Any favorites?
Oh, I mean, I was just going to say, so we have a very similar workflow. One of the things that we did that was quite cool is one of our engineering managers, Alicia, like took ownership of Product Responder a few months ago. And one of the first things she did was to put herself on like a secondary rota. So she gets like Slack notifications for any incidents, and that basically just like gives her a whole load of visibility. And then now that we can hook that up to Linear, she now does the same thing with Linear. And so she gets like all of the triage notifications, and it just gives her like a pulse and an ability to run that team in a way that would have been really, really difficult when you didn't have all of those things routing to her. And the thing that's even better about that is when she's on holiday, we can route those things to other people. So you don't have to have like hard coded some random script. It's just like, it's like getting on call cover. It's just triage cover. So yeah, I think that feels really nice. And then follow-ups also feels really nice. So for us, we have like auto export follow-ups turned on, which basically means I like write a message in an incident channel, or our AI is like, hey, you said you wanted to do this thing. And we're like, great, create a follow-up. And that ends up just like in Linear, in the list of things that are going to get triaged the next morning at stand-up. And I think that having that flow really nicely definitely means we do more follow-ups, and it means we do them more quickly, and it also means that like the context is all hooked together. So I've got a GitHub pull request, a linear ticket, and an incident IO incident, and all of them are linked kind of like into this triangle. And then when inevitably it turns out I screwed it up and we have an incident about it in 6 months' time, I can then go back and I can see all of those things. And I think that to me is like really, really magical, being able to, from the Git blame, get to the like, what was the incident that happened that made us decide to make this change in the first place? What is the change that we made, and why, what is the context on the linear ticket of somebody going, I've debugged it and I think it is probably because of blah, blah, blah. And then also like the code itself. It just builds up such a richer picture than what I was used to in my previous life, where you had a Git blame, and then you had a pull request, and you looked at the pull request, and then it linked to an issue tracker that we'd probably moved off because we'd migrated issue trackers like once every 18 months for about 4 years. And in the GitHub pull request, it would just be like, I'm fixing this bug. And you'd sort of nod and smile and go, I'm going to just have to fix this from first principles now. So yeah, I feel like that personally makes my life a lot easier when I'm particularly when I'm on call, if I'm responding to incidents.
100%. Oh, you're making me miss the days of being a little bit closer to product development. Anyway, this has been a lot of fun. Sabine, Lisa, thank you both so much for everything. I think this is going to be a great one for us to share with the world. Thanks so much.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Chris.